Next, welcome Atlantic contributing writer and co-host of Showtime's The Circus, Alex Wagner.
Voting is at the heart of our democracy, but even in 2020, the right to vote is not guaranteed. While some allege voter fraud is rampant, others point to voter suppression as the real issue, the one denying many Americans their most fundamental right. Stacey Abrams knows too well about voter suppression, something she claims cost her the Georgia governor election in 2018. She is now the founder of Fair Fight Action, and she joins me now. Stacey, great to see you. Thank you for coming to the Atlantic Festival.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
So let's just start first with the project you've been, most immediately involved in as it concerns the viewing public. All In. It's a new documentary. It is a riveting, distressing documentary on Amazon that chronicles voter suppression in America. What I took away from the documentary is that disenfranchising people of color as far as their right to vote has been something this country has been fixated on since its inception. And I wonder, in making this documentary, do you think anything has measurably changed on that front other than the tactics by which we have aimed to suppress that vote?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that the goal of the documentary was not simply to raise the havocs of everyone and the panic of the persistence of voter suppression, but to show the progress. At the inception of our country, we denied the humanity of Blacks, the existence of Native Americans, and the utility of women. And then you add in the 1790 Naturalization Act that said that only white people of good character would be allowed into the country. And so we've made dramatic progress through the 15th Amendment, through the 19th Amendment, through the Naturalization and Immigration Act of 1965, and of course, through the Voting Rights Act. What has happened, though, in the last 20 years, and more acutely since 2013, is a retrenchment, where we had this halcyon period during the Voting Rights Act, nearly 50 years, where we were really working to expand the vote. And now we've returned to defending the vote. And we're defending it for people of color, for young people, for poor people. And as long as we have to defend the right to vote, we're not engaging in the real work of democracy, which is engaging all of our citizens in the decision-making of our country.
It feels like, voter suppression has always been of interest and importance, especially to those whose votes were getting suppressed. But it feels like it's taken on a sort of national alarm in the pandemic. President Trump seems to have realized early on in the pandemic that mail-in voting would be an area that could be manipulated, shall we say, for partisan gain. When the pandemic struck, given all the work that you're doing on voter suppression, did you think the same thing?
Well, we knew that there would be a catastrophe in 2020. We had no idea it would be a pandemic, but we knew that the 2020 election was going to be a mano-a-mano fight about whether we were going to be a democracy that looked to expand the access of the right to vote for those who were entitled, or an attempt to limit those rights. Because this is a fight about power. Who has it and who has the right to use it? Donald Trump and his cronies realized early on that when more people participate, that changes the composition of the electorate. And often the people who've been not participating were the ones who would likely want something different. And so he told the absolute truth when he said he was deeply afraid that people using the right to vote, to the extent that vote by mail would allow it, meaning that more people would be able to use the convenience of voting, that it would harm his reelection chances. But that's not a justification for the behavior that he's exhibited or for the fights that are being waged across this country. Because when we return to the fundamentals of democracy, no one who believes in our country should be fighting to stop people who are legally eligible for voting, to stop them from doing so.
Well, let's just drill into the tactics that are being employed at present. The first is the sort of under-resourcing or dismantling of the resources at the U.S. Postal Service, which is predicted to play an outsized role in this election, given the fact that a lot of people are going to be voting by mail, a large proportion of them Democrats. You have seen the news coverage. You know well how the system works. Do you think that it could be the tactics employed thus far could be effective in sowing chaos at the very least, if not outright disenfranchisement on election day.
I believe that had the Louis DeJoy Donald Trump tactic gone unnoticed, it would, or certainly unattacked, it would have worked. They were attempting to slow down the process of mail delivery, but also sow chaos, as you pointed out. What went wrong for them was that the Postal Service is more than just a way to win an election. The Postal Service is how people get medicine, how they get food. If you've ever lived in a rural area, it is a lifeline. And this deep underestimation of just the vitality and the utility of the Postal Service worked against them. And because there was a hue and cry that went up in August and not in October, I think we've mitigated much, but not all of the harm that was done to the Postal Service. As you and I both know, the sorting machines in too many of our post offices are now irreparably damaged. I lived next door to a post office, and I went to go and mail something, and my mailbox, the little box I used to drop off my mail, had been taped shut. Luckily, the tape came off, but we're not going to see this reorganization of sorting machines. But because of that, we have seen citizens take responsibility and demand drop boxes in their community. They now know where their county election office is. And so I think the chaos intentionality is still there and it's still working. But what's different in this year is that when voter suppression reared its head yet again, people were ready to see it and ready to fight back. And that was the purpose of All In. That's the purpose of Fair Fight. That's why I wrote my book on it. That's why I've been working on this for so long. It's not enough to know something exists if you can't articulate it and fight back against it.
It just feels like strategically, to say nothing of morally or ethically, the president made a misstep and his allies made a misstep in telegraphing that they were going to try and undermine the institutions that are engaged to provide a fair vote. And there is nothing that motivates people to go to the polls or to cast votes or to organize than being told that they are being disenfranchised. So tactically, it just feels like a real misstep. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. Let's be clear. Voter suppression is not only not new, it's not even new in the 21st century. We have been used to this notion that voter suppression is violent and oppressive and visible. And what's been so unique about voter suppression in the 21st century is that it looks like administrative rules. It looks like barriers erected by bureaucracies. And as Americans, we've gotten used to bureaucratic barriers, so we just roll with them. What we've tried to do, and certainly what I tried to do with my election, was to acknowledge the legal sufficiency of the election based on the rules that they existed, but to call out the rules themselves and to say, I'm not going to make myself governor. My anger and dismay is not sufficient to overcome what the rules say. But for the voters who were denied their right to be heard, that should anger you. And you should attack a system that denies you your agency as a citizen. And because we have spent more time since 2018 in conversation about this, in deliberate action about this, yes, the Republicans, mainly led by Donald Trump, but let's be very clear, this is a Republican strategy that has been imposed and employed across this country. The notion was it had worked in 2016, it worked in 2017, worked in 2018. Why should it not work in 2020? The difference was we started talking about it, because you're absolutely right. When people are afraid, they tend to curl into themselves. They tend to be scared. They tend not to act. But when they're angry, people want what's theirs. Even if they don't plan to use it, you don't have the right to take it from them. And what we were able to do in this year and in this context is rile up righteous indignation to overwhelm the chaos and fear.
In the right timeline. Speaking of timelines, I have to ask you, there are an army of lawyers on both sides here that are preparing for intense litigation after the election. There is something that has been termed in the political media a red mirage. President Trump may get an initially a plurality, a majority of the votes that are cast on election day, but as the votes are counted in the days after the election, there may be what is termed a blue shift, where it looks like Democrats, where it appears numerically, the Democrats have actually won either critical seats or the presidency itself. A lot of people are saying we are headed towards civil unrest. What do you think?
I think our first responsibility is to understand that we are living in an election season. It's just last call. It is not the closing down of the process. And because it's last call, our responsibility is to recognize that every vote cast, starting on September 4th in North Carolina through November 3rd, that those votes all count equally. And how we deliver those votes does not eradicate the utility and importance of those votes. The second piece is that phalanx of attorneys you're talking about, they have been fighting litigation since June. And the reality is the fights that are being waged now matter as much as the fights that will be waged after the election. But the bottom line is delays in counting votes do not signal that someone has cheated or that the system is rigged. What it signals is that the system is working. It should take time to count hand votes. It should take time to verify. And when the states declare that they have finished their job, that's when we know. And that is why I've been working to call upon the media to not call the election. No one should be allowed to declare victory until we actually have information. We can't panic, but we also can't misunderstand math. You can't count something as done when there's still information out there. And whether that information is a blue shift, a red mirage, or more importantly, simply the process working, we have to have the patience of our process because that's what our democracy demands in a pandemic.
In short, we should stop referring to it as election day and call it election season because it may not be days but weeks. Let me sort of get your thoughts about the moment we stand at right now. Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away last week. There is a fierce partisan battle inside what is a larger kind of existential war happening inside the country. What are your thoughts about the ways in which the Republicans in particular have reacted, the speed with which the president intends to nominate a successor, and what that does to the balance of power in our democracy?
One of the pieces we took pains to explain in All In for the Fight for Democracy was that voter suppression isn't a partisan issue. Different parties use it. The Whigs used it at the start of the country. Democrats were very strong purveyors in the 20th century. And in the 21st century, it's the province of Republicans, because this is a fight over power. And it's a power over what we are as a country, where we go as a country, and who counts in our country. When I learned the news of Justice Ginsburg's death, I was saddened and dismayed, but I think in a different way than many, because I'm a lawyer who follows the court. I know that the tilting of the court happened with the seating of Brett Kavanaugh. This is another flashpoint that reminds us of how our systems work or don't work. We've become so fixated on the courts in part because of the remarkable inactivity of our Congress, namely the US Senate. And if all three branches of government actually work the way they should, we would see less emphasis on these seats. But unfortunately, we are in a moment in our country where power is shifting, where the composition of our country is different. In addition to the work I'm doing on voter protection, I'm fighting hard to save the census, because we're about to have the most inaccurate census in nearly a century. We cannot allow that, because it's also part of how we share and shift and gauge power in this country. And so where I stand is that we can't become so fixated either on winning an election that we miss losing the future. We can't become so fixated on one seat that we missed the other mechanisms for power in our country. And we cannot be so fixated on the presidency that we ignore Congress, state legislatures, even down ballot races as low as school board, because that's where so many of these conversations start. My mission is for us to understand our democracy and to allow as many people as possible to shape what the future looks like, but not let one battle consume the entire conversation of who we're going to be.
I wonder how you think, there's the poison we dose ourselves with, the battles we fight amongst ourselves. And then there are the external threats. And we talk a lot about voter suppression as a sort of self-inflicted wound. But we know from data, from intelligence briefings, that there are foreign actors that are seeking to undermine the integrity of American elections. Where does that rate on a sort of your scale of importance in terms of the threats, the balance of power and democracy, the having a responsive government that is reflective of the will of the people? How much are you up at night thinking or worrying about Russian interference?
I'm concerned about Russian interference, Chinese interference. If Myanmar gets angry, that's problematic. But part of my responsibility is to focus on the levers I can move. And unfortunately, our federal government, namely the president and the Republican-held U.S. Senate, has abdicated responsibility for action on foreign interference. But we know that foreign interference is largely designed to sow chaos, to alter the actual composition of votes by hacking into our databases and hacking into our voting machines. And that's one of the reasons vote by mail is so important in this year. It is a way to audit our elections. We will know how people voted because it will be on a piece of paper. It is not a solution to foreign interference, and the abdication of responsibility by the Republican-held Senate is wrongheaded. The abdication of responsibility, in fact, the refusal to acknowledge responsibility by the president, is unconscionable. But the best way to meet the challenge of foreign interference is by overwhelming the polls with our presence. Foreign interference is designed to erode our trust and to disturb our ability to cast those ballots. But when we add more and more people to the process, their effectiveness is diminished, and that's the way I have to approach this conversation.
Let me just ask you a question for everybody at home. Able-bodied people who have access to PPE and can make the choice between voting in person or by mail. Do you have guidance for them this November?
Absolutely. So one of the great things we did with the documentary, it's a website called allinforvoting.com. And my message is this: make a plan. So if you have the right to vote by mail with no excuses, and you do right now in 45 states, no excuses in 41 states, 4 other states let you use COVID as an excuse. But if you can vote by mail, plan to vote by mail, but plan for there to be some challenges. So then make a backup plan. In 40 states, you can vote early. Know if you can vote early in your state. So if vote by mail does not work, then you have the backup plan of going to vote in person early. And if that fails for some reason, then plan to go and vote on election day. But this notion that you can game the system and figure out which one works just isn't true. You don't know what the problem's going to be, but the best defense is to know what all of your options are and to be ready to use them. And very quickly, I'll tell you, I intended to vote by mail in June this year in our primary in Georgia. Got my absentee ballot, filled it out, got ready to put it in the envelope, and the envelope was sealed shut. In Georgia, it is against the law for me to slit open that envelope, put my ballot inside, and tape it. I happen to know that. So I knew I had to instead vote in person. I was ready, and therefore I was able to cast my vote. But thousands of people across this country live in states where they would have just used the tape because it makes sense, and their votes would have been thrown out. I want those folks to know that when you look and you can't find your ballot and they say your vote hasn't counted, be ready for that to be the problem, because no one has time to learn election law. Know that your next step is to go and vote in person and then vote on election day. But I don't give primacy to any one of those options. I say use as many of the options as possible, but only vote once. Contrary to what the president says, only vote once.
Stacey, I'm not going to dwell on the fact that someone in Georgia made sure that your ballot envelope was sealed. Could it be coincidence or could it be deliberate? But we are very glad that you're Stacey Abrams and already had a backup plan to the plan. Everyone out there should have one as well. And they should also, before they vote, watch All In, which is available to watch on Amazon.com. Stacey Abrams, it is always wonderful to hear from you. Thank you for everything you're doing, and thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Alex. It's always a pleasure to be with you.